Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great honor to be in this most distinguished university, whose origins and roots resonate so deeply with me and have been an inspiration. Today was a magical day, seeing the future generations thinking and being inspired by what the built environment can be. And I hope that this lecture, as lofty as the title may sound, maybe can be a small device to help you think about small, medium, and large ways that we can contribute as architects to this idea of the modernity and the growth of our continent, our nation, our spaces, our homes, our villages. For me, I think 8 years ago, I returned back to Accra, where my father left many years ago when he was a diplomat in Nkrumah's diplomatic corps. And in coming home with my family, it was a long dream for me to return and to open a practice on the continent of the continent of my birth, but also the continent of my ancestors. Architecture for me started not as a desire for form making or the excitement of construction, all of which are very special. But architecture for me is really a conversation about empowering, edifying, and dealing with the injustices that are inherent, of course, in the world, but also in the built environment. For me, growing up as a young person, moving across the world in the 70s and 80s, I felt a world where there was an incredible optimism in the land that I came from, with my parents and the conversations that they were having amongst their elders as young children sitting under the sort of stools or tables where elders were speaking about the future of Africa. But when I went into the world, I realized that there was a disconnect between the world that was forming and the worlds that we inhabited. And very quickly realized that the world of the continent and the knowledge of the continent didn't have the stage that it should have. Today I was speaking with some students in one of the sessions, and one of the most beautiful moments was this idea that they felt that they no longer needed to justify being African architects. And that seems like such a simple thing to say, but 30 years ago that was not easy to say, actually. 30 years ago you had to justify yourself as an architect of color, not an African architect, but an architect of color, by assimilating into the dominant narratives, and that somehow architecture was only produced through the dominant narratives. And that for me was a social injustice. In fact, it was one of the things that spurred my entire career. And it was the fire for me that really has been the fuel, and still is the fuel, to imagining an African future. What I want to show you are about 6 or 7 projects, I think, small to large, and each one being a discourse that starts from the time that we started the office in Accra. This is the second version. In fact, the first version of trying to come to Accra was actually in around 2012, 13, 14, Kofi. And we actually came into Accra very quietly and desperately wanted to be part of the scene, but were completely ignored. In fact, I actually went bankrupt because I had no work. But I had one mentor at that time that deeply inspired me, and that was one of your great alum, who is one of your great heroes and one of the heroes of the continent, Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan commissioned me to make a villa for him in the countryside. And he didn't need it, but I think he just saw pity on me and gave me this commission and allowed me to explore a way of making architecture which is the DNA of what now is the work that I'm doing. In that small project that I made outside Accra, I explored this idea of a disaggregated form of local, of climate, energy reduction, of the tonality and the cultural framing of our environment. And I hope that in these projects that now are emanating from Accra and going around the continent, you can see a story unfolding that I'm very excited about, that I'm very inspired by, to continue doing architecture and to expand the possibility of what architecture can do as this continent lifts up and takes its rightful place on the global stage. Next. I will start with a small project, probably the first project. The first project that we did when we came back in 2019. And it was inspired by an amazing young artist called Amwako Boafo, one of the great young stars of Ghana right now, a painter who studied in Vienna and has come back. And what struck me in the conversations that he had with me at that time was his desire to make, in any small way that he could, deeply inspired by the work of artists like Kehinde Wiley and these other sort of much more major stars, a contribution to the art ecosystem in his home country, even though he was getting a lot of success everywhere else. He wanted to implant something back in his community. And I found it so deeply inspiring that a young artist who traditionally, as they become successful, would want to move to the West or anything like that, was actually deeply interested in building infrastructure because he couldn't see the infrastructure that he felt was needed in his own place. So this project for us was not economic. It was really a kind of trade between artists. And we wanted to create a project that would demonstrate in this community in La and Accra, next, let me go, a way of seeing how if political and institutional support was lacking, how could citizens, artists, creatives, create and contribute towards an infrastructure and a dialogue about what we need in our societies and in our urban cities. Next. I don't know if the man can hear me. Next. So next. This is just a sample of the work that the Dot Atelier, as it's become known, and it's more than one institution. He's building several institutions and working with different architects, which is deeply inspiring, has been doing in its community. Next. Some of the artists in the program, the project brief was very simple. Can we make a space for artists to be inspired to work that could be from the local context, but also international? Could we make a space to show art? And could we make a space that artists could just convene? You know that gathering, in a university you think gathering is normal, but actually when you're in the world, you'll realize that gathering is one of the most radical things you can do. To gather with like-minded people and to be able to exchange ideas about the contemporary is one of the most precious things that we need in our societies, to exchange ideas with our peers and to hear each other's voices. So this project was not only just a studio and an exhibition space, but a gathering place and a library for the artist community. Next. It's in the area that Nkrumah, as he was establishing his administration, cleared the communities there, sad and also the way in which the world was then, cleared what they thought were slums, and created a new urban plan. It's one of the areas where a grid plan is established with bungalows that were made for the political communities that were growing. And now obviously has changed, that has completely changed. But it's one of the most interesting, vibrant areas that artists have gravitated towards in Accra. And this is the La area. Next. Next. This is just zooming in to give you a sense of where it is. Sort of in this area, which has really predominantly been about bungalows, there's now, as the land values have increased, a desire to, grow the heights, increase the opportunity of yield from the land. But here, we wanted to make an institutional building that would become a landmark that wasn't about the commerce that was erupting all around, but about cultural infrastructure that had the equivalent energy and power as the commercial enterprise around it. In a way, signaling to the community that it's not just about making money, but it's also about making something that contributes back to the community. Next. This is just really the research that we did on the communities, the fishing villages that were there before, the clearances, the master plans. This is an area that has had a lot of thoughts in the founding of independent Ghana. Next. And it's interesting to me when we were looking at this that they were modernist bungalows, but before that they were earth structures. And so we decided that we wanted to look at the communities of earth structures as well as the modern technology. In the work, always oscillating between the ancient and the future is my mantra to my team, that the work must seem at once completely new, but at once completely familiar. Inhabiting this dual world, for me, is the radicality of architecture. Next. We looked at that and created a small tower. I call it a small tower pavilion project, which really is a study on air, light, view, and frame. On the ground floor, how you enter. In the middle, the studio body, the heart, and in the top, the showing space with all its light. We decided that we wanted to make a plan that was not a traditional plan. It would be something where the rooms would be singular. There would be no corridors in this building, to take away the corridor and to make the circulation, the system which organizes the way in which you arrive to each space as you rise. Next. So on the ground floor, you enter library, cafe at the back, entry offices, etc., gatehouse, garden in the back. Next. And then the rooms, and then you can see the perimeter is where the service systems and the circulation run, always creating a rectangular proportioned room in the heart. Next. Then this is the form of the building from above. It's a frame building. I mean, I don't know if you know, but Accra is on a major earthquake fault line. So we can't just build anything we want. We have to build with a structure that is sustainable, but also able to deal with all the issues that could happen in the cycles that are inevitable in Accra. So it's a frame building, and I wanted to express that. And then the material body of it, the largest amount of area, is the lowest carbon material, the ancient material, the earth material, which is rammed, in this case, with hammers. And when we started this project, nobody was ramming or doing rammed earth in Accra, except for traditional people in the countryside. And we wanted to train a team who would start to really be able to scale up. And even before we had finished, the teams had started to leave to get other work. So we were training, people were excited, they were being poached, and they started to become artists, and everything started to happen. And it was amazing. For us, this was an incredible explosion, and something where we're now training a new generation of ram earth artisans. And for us, this expansion of these kinds of new models of construction is really important to creating an experimental nature, but also creating an environment where we are able to try and connect to other ways of construction beyond what we've been told are the standard models. Next. This is the building in its context. So you can imagine in these bungalows, you see the gray building is the traditional building, or the white building behind it are the commercial architectures that are taking the area. And what we wanted to do was to create this new form. So even though there is no space in this planning for an institutional building, this is, because it's essentially residential, except for the church buildings which serve important nodes, this becomes another kind of institutional building, a small monument, as I call it, in that environment. Next. The approach is very simple. Next, it has one framing view to the environment. The materials are very basic. In a way, for me, enjoying the limits of the material opportunity was exciting. In a world where you can do anything you want, actually to have limits because of whatever you want to say, GDP or import problems, to be able to have limits can be an extraordinary accelerator. I trained with an architect called Alvaro Siza, and Alvaro Siza in Portugal would always talk about this time when Portugal was a very poor country, had come out from being in a fascist construction. They had no artisans, but he, unlike his fellow architects who were looking at everything around the world, would work with local people to train up skills, metalworking, plastering, rendering, and just use the limits to make expansion. We are always told limits are a problem, but actually creatives know that limits can create extraordinary expansion, and that can create radicality. Next. The library, next. The way in which the building works is that it's an open staircase. It's not enclosed. So it is working with this idea of the inside-outside, the tropical. It is not an enclosed system until you get to the rooms. In a way like our houses, which have their porches before the rooms, or our courtyard compounds, which have their open circulatory systems before the rooms. This is a vertical interpretation of the same idea. The studio where artists would work, next. The way in which it frames its context, giving you framing to where you are, next. The gallery up above, and sort of really reminding you that this is a building made out of earth, made out of rammed earth. And then it's zenithal lights, which allow the galleries to not have any need for electricity when the sun is rising and before the sun is set. You only need lights when the sun goes down, because we're on the equator and we keep forgetting. There's no reason for us to have buildings with lights. I always say to my teams, we should be able to design buildings that harvests natural light abundantly without solar gain. That is a basic of our environment. Next.